every city holds its secrets, even ours. We think that we know it well because we grew up there or because we live there day to day. And yet, there are hidden stories everywhere, just waiting to be discovered. This is what we're doing today, a small treasure hunt in search of hidden objects and places that can bring us back in time. This is Urban Tales, a podcast from If Experience in collaboration with Cora Media. And now, let's move forward. Some cities are built with the knowledge that eventually the ground may start trembling below them. They thrive on fault lines that generate enormous amounts of energy, capable of shaking the surface from deep below. Then, there are cities that are built on a different type of line, but just as powerful. A line of time that connects them to the past. Rome has thrived upon this timeline for centuries. No city can ever run from its past. But for Rome, it's a whole different story, because the history of this city seems to spring from every corner, from the very ground and from every house. In the city of Rome, the present coexists every day with the past, and constantly seeks a way towards the future. Such a situation always leads to new surprises and unexpected stories, like those that we will see in this episode. Here, we'll look at three protagonists: a boxer, a saint, and a baker. Although the true main character is always her, Rome. Termini train station. No matter how far one has traveled away from the city or for how long, for every Roman, it always represents the safe embrace of a universal, atavistic, eternal home. Stepping off the train, you pass through the large covered pedestrian walkway, in a limbo of commuters, workers and tourists, all caught in the flow of departures and arrivals, until being pushed toward the outside by the frantic movement of the majestic platform canopy. You only need to raise your gaze to admire the lines that run through the roof, seemingly an ideal extension of the tracks. This is the so-called dinosaur, built in 1950 for the Jubilee, one of those grand works that, like today, were meant to welcome visitors and pilgrims. Its structure, an elegant and bold architectural gesture, is the hallmark of the station's contemporary grandeur. Yet, its sinuous form immediately plunges us into Rome's multimillennial heritage. Indeed, its outline mirrors the profile of a fragment of the Servian walls, framed by the large glass window at the far right of the wall. The tough blocks of the city's earliest walls, built by the legendary kings of Rome in the 6th century before Christ, run outside along the side of the square, standing out against the station's imposing light surfaces. This immediately conveys an impressive sense of historical depth in a hypnotic dialogue between the early 20th century and the city's ancient origins. We are outside. The vast Piazza dei Cinquecento expands the view towards the city. In the background are the buildings of the Bath Museum, with the still visible remains of the Bath of Diocletian, the largest of the ancient Rome's baths, constructed in the 3rd century AD, originally occupying the entire vast area in front of the station. Its extraordinary expanse included the Grand Exedra of Piazza della Repubblica and was framed at the corners by two circular halls. While the northern one was transformed into the Church of San Bernardo, the one toward the station is still visible on the left side of the square, like a round masonry tower jutting out from the 18th century block to the right of Palazzo Massimo, the National Roman Museum. And this is exactly where we are going now, crossing the square to meet the first protagonist of the episode. Walking through the rooms of this museum is almost like browsing through an extraordinary book. On its 4 floors, we can find some of the greatest masterpieces of Roman art: sculptures, reliefs, frescoes, mosaics, stuccos, and sarcophagi. But in the ground floor rooms is displayed the amazing portrait of a surprising character. It is the bronze statue of a boxer at rest, dating back to the 1st century before Christ. The boxer is depicted at the end of a violent match. He is sitting, recovering his strength, and assessing his injuries. The bandages that wrapped his knuckles still hang from his wrists, and his entire body is marked by red streaks made with copper inlays. These mark the spots where his opponent managed to strike him, causing wounds and bleeding. His posture combines both the suffering of the moment and a great calm, with his head turned to the right as if he were conversing with someone else, perhaps commenting the result of the fight. The sculpture is striking with its realism. The boxer is almost alive and breathing, as if he stands up and resumes the fight at any moment. It really feels as if we were meeting a man from ancient times, flesh and blood. In the same room, there's also a photograph of the statue's chance discovery, back in 1885. The image shows the boxer sitting in the corner of a massive construction excavation, as if he had been patiently waiting centuries for someone to dig right at the spot. Leaving Palazzo Massimo, we find ourselves once again in the vast Piazza dei Cinquecento. The chaotic expanse in front of the station is set to become a green urban forest, according to the design by the architectural firm Its Vision. This is because 2025 is the year of the Jubilee, in which Rome is once again at the center of attention. This event is of utmost importance for the Catholic Church, people of faith, and the very city itself, which has been preparing for months, carrying out works and renovations for the enormous amount of international visitors that are about to come to the city. The Jubilee is an ancient event, rooted in Jewish tradition. The word derives from the Hebrew Yobel, which is the sound of the ram horn used to the beginning of this festivity that occurred only once every 50 years. It was Pope Boniface VIII, in the 14th century, who introduced the first Catholic Jubilee, also known as the Holy Year, in which the faithful would make their pilgrimage to Rome and thus feel God's sanctity and power for salvation along their journey. The path is still marked today by specific destinations, especially the holy doors of the four papal basilicas of Rome: San Pietro in Vaticano, San Giovanni in Laterano, San Paolo fuori le mura, e Santa Maria Maggiore. In terms of numbers, it was immediately a roaring success. In the year 1300, the number of pilgrims that visited Rome reached 400,000. Dante himself seems to have participated in this first Holy Year, and in the verses of the 8th canto of his Inferno, the poet recalls that, to cope with the incredible flow of pilgrims on the Ponte Sant'Angelo, the bridge leading to St. Peter, the Romans regulated the crossing in opposite directions, towards St. Peter or Monte Giordano. The frequency of the Jubilee has changed over the centuries. Initially, it was held every 100 years, then reduced to 50, and finally, since 1470, once every 25 years. Beyond its original spiritual significance, this event has become a recurring opportunity for the city renewal and discovery. Some places are easy to find and often overcrowded, while others require seeking out more hidden signs, revealing nearly forgotten presences within the vastness of Roman beauty. In search of one of these forgotten jewels, we move away from the bath and the city center. The station's cylindrical water tank is the signal for our next stop, along the left side of the station. Walking down Via Giolitti, the straight road that follows the railway tracks as they exit the city, our gaze is captured by an extraordinarily heterogeneous sequence of urban signs. Along this road are embedded exceptional testimonies of Rome's art and life, which reveal, here more than elsewhere, the dazzling layering of its historical identities. The road is marked by the arches of the Mazzonian wing of the station, the gigantic travertine surface from the 1940s, which seems to stretch endlessly in the metaphysical element of the landscape, bringing together all the other urban objects in a kind of timeless list. It looks like a painting by De Chirico. On the right, the contrast with the buildings of the Savoy era is interrupted by the Guglielmo Pepe Square, featuring the Ambra Iovinelli Theatre, the only one in Rome built in the Art Nouveau style. It is a precious memory of Rome's Belle Époque and the golden age of vaudeville, where performers such as Petrolini and Totò made their debut. The sinuous decoration of its facade looks upon the square as if to perform in front of the ancient arches of the aqueduct that stare back. On the left side, just past the water tower, we encounter a seemingly modest building trapped between the rational and massive railway structures, the train track and the tram rails, the small basilica of Santa Bibiana. Nowadays, this Baroque gem often goes unnoticed, but it's a true hidden treasure of fundamental artistic importance. Indeed, back in the day, it marked the start of a new chapter in Roman art, as it was the first architectural design by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, housing his first religious sculpture, as well as the first important cycle of frescoes by Pietro da Cortona. The original church dates back to the 4th century, but was later renovated by the commission of Urban VIII for the 1625 Jubilee year. Bernini was just a young man, although he had already caught the eye of the greatest patrons of the time. Yet, in this first work, we can see the beginning of his groundbreaking career as an architect. The portico, a remnant of the ancient structure, was incorporated within a so-called palace-style facade. But to truly appreciate the 17th century theatricality, we should imagine the whole ensemble with the elements that were later altered. The entrance staircase, the large papal coat of arms at the top of the timpano, and the chiaroscuro of the depth of the grand niche. However, the charm of the church becomes more evident in its interior. As we enter, the chaotic overlap of street noises fades into the silence of the nave. We are drawn into a scenic space. The ancient columns rhythmically guide the gaze. Above, the surface resulted from the closure of the medieval windows are orchestrated with the bright colors of the frescoes. The intensity of the light is all focused on the altar. Here, the sculpture of a saint emerges white and vivid from a dark niche covered in slate, drawing all attention to itself. The cult of Santa Bibiana was very popular in Roman tradition. She was one of the early Christian martyrs of the late imperial period, just like Sant'Agnese, Santa Cecilia and Santa Susanna. Her life and death were strongly rooted to the religious identity of Rome itself. According to the story, she was persecuted along with her family by Emperor Julian, who attempted to restore the pagan faith, and she was chained to a column, flayed and killed right here where her house once stood. Bernini depicts her in a moment of ecstasy as she is about to pass away. Her gaze turned towards the sky, her posture soft and dynamic, the light of the drapery highlighting her movement. Every element is carefully designed to convey the mystical rapture, contributing to the portrayal of the passion and emotionally involving the viewer. There it is, the Baroque. Indeed, this work seems like a prelude to more sensational and celebrated sculptures such as Santa Teresa and the blessed Ludovico Albertoni, which Bernini will create much later in full artistic maturity. So, Santa Bibiana becomes a journey through more than 1,000 years of history. Beneath its 17th century facade, we can still see the signs of a medieval church. The story of her life takes us back to the late antiquity, to the very birth of Christianity, and even further to the splendor of the imperial era. This is underlined by the reused columns in the nave, particularly the oldest one at the entrance, protected by a gilded bronze grille, the column of the saint's martyrdom. According to the legend, the dust from its red marble, when mixed with water from the well outside, creates a potion that cures epilepsy. Likewise, the herbs in the nearby garden were also believed to be miraculous. As we move further back in time, we are suddenly jolted by the vibration of a passing train. The present time beckons, pulling us back to our steps in the city of today. As we leave the church behind and we follow the large travertine walls, we soon find ourselves in front of another important relic of antiquity. An imposing masonry ruin that seems to be even more of an obstacle to this road access. This structure is mistakenly known as the Temple of Minerva Medica, due to the discovery of a statue of the goddess Minerva, but was actually a large nymphaeum, a pavilion that was part of the lavish buildings of the Orti Liciniani, an enormous park which, in the 3rd century, was part of the imperial residence of Gallieno, with pools and bucket holes. In ancient times, these aristocratic gardens took up the entire surrounding area, which over the centuries was divided into lands and vineyards of the papal nobility. It can be hard to imagine this part of the city, with its heavy traffic and buildings, as a vast rural landscape where ancient structures rose isolated. A very different scene. Indeed, it was like this until just over 150 years ago, and it was the same view that inspired many of the greatest artists from the Renaissance onward who came to study and sketch these architectural monuments. The Temple of Minerva Medica, with its decagonal architecture, was an important model for many architects, not the least Brunelleschi, who took inspiration from its dome, the third largest after the Pantheon and the Bath of Caracalla, to model that of the Cathedral in Florence. Following a gentle bend around this precious monument, Via Giolitti continues alongside the tram tracks, leading us to another ancient treasure, the extraordinary Porta Maggiore. Via Giolitti ends in a huge square, a large, chaotic space where roads, tracks and trams intersect and cross the remains of ancient aqueducts and city walls. We are at Piazza di Porta Maggiore. As we attempt to grasp the area's layout and read its confused stratification, the gaze is caught by the light travertine of an ancient structure. It is the imposing gate of the Emperor Claudius, built in 52 AD, to mark the point where his aqueduct crossed the junction of the consular roads La Bicana and Prenestina. Indeed, here is where the waters of 8 of Rome's 11 aqueducts converged. The 2 arches and the entire structure of the gate are clad in rough blocks, as was the rustic style of the period. And at the top of the attic, the channels of the Aqua Claudia and the Anio Novus aqueducts are still visible. Porta Maggiore would later be incorporated into the Aurelian walls, a defensive perimeter built in the 3rd century AD to protect Rome from possible barbarian attacks, as the city had expanded well beyond its previous Servian walls. These new protections would incorporate the aqueducts and their structure for defensive purposes. This entire area, which, due to its proximity to an old temple dedicated to the goddess of hope, was called the Spem Veterem, is rich in ancient artifacts, small funerary monuments, burial structures and underground chambers. At the border of this busy crossing, the train tracks inevitably run through. Until now, they have been a constant presence in the background of our exploration, but now they're part of a story that brings us back more than 100 years. The year is 1917. Works on the train lines of Stazione Termini are fully underway when part of the construction site suddenly collapses. Workers find a hole in the ground, but it isn't a natural chasm. Rather, it's the vault of a basilica entirely built underground. It's a shocking discovery, especially since there were no historical reports of such a place, either here or elsewhere. After digging away the earth that had partially filled it, the archaeologists soon realized that they're standing inside a perfectly preserved 1st century pagan temple. Today, this extraordinary treasure is accessible only by reservation, but the descent into its enchanting underground spaces is certainly worth a visit. The space is arranged into 3 small naves, similar to a countryside church. But there is nothing Christian here. The decoration seems to indicate a Neo-Pythagorean cult. The ceilings and walls are covered in exquisite stuccos depicting ritual objects and scenes, as well as episodes of Hellenistic mythology linked to the fate of the soul and esoteric initiations. Indeed, this is a temple dedicated to a mystery cult, where only a selected few would be admitted. Due to its secrecy, we know very little about this cult, although we do know that its goal was to conquer death through metempsychosis, meaning the reincarnation of the immortal soul, which would return to Earth repeatedly, seeking its perfect form. After the boxer and the saint, now it's time for the baker. His name is Eurisace, and his tomb is located just a few meters from Porta Maggiore. It's a curious structure, a cubic form over 7 meters in height, which might seem like a work from the Rationalist era, and could easily be mistaken for a war memorial from the 1930s. But it's actually 2,000 years older, since Eurisace was a baker of the 1st century BC, and this monument was built to celebrate his profession and social rise. From the inscription, we can trace his identity and life. He was probably of Greek origin, a freedman who progressively opened many bakeries in the city, becoming an esteemed entrepreneur, rising as high as to work as the attendant for an important priest or magistrate of the state. For this reason, he wanted his modest trade, the cause of his rise in society, to be remembered on his sepulchre. The frieze at the top of depicts the various stages of bread preparation and baking, while the lower part shows a series of circular cavities, a motif that echoes the shape of the containers used for the flour doubt. Of course, it might seem strange to find the tomb right at this point, surrounded by traffic and sticking out like an object out of place and context. However, long before the aqueducts and the walls, there used to be thousands of funerary monuments here along the consular roads. A vast linear cemetery made up of columns, mausoleums and tombs, built according to the Roman tradition, for which the deceased would continue to live in memory as long as passers-by would read aloud the inscriptions on their graves. Today, the only one left is that of the baker and his wife, an important relic for its unique shape, as well for its intense portrayal of the history and daily life of a Roman from 2,000 years ago. In a simple glance at Porta Maggiore, we see a 2,000-years-old tomb, the aqueducts and the Aurelian walls, the tram passing through it with cars and buses circling around, the train tracks in the background, and just a few steps away, the entrance to a secret basilica dedicated to a mysterious cult. No city in the world can combine so much history and so many stories in such a small space. It is the clearest proof of how Rome is a city in constant evolution, that continues to transform while preserving the marks of its 1,000-year-old history and treasures, to build and preserve, year after year, its eternity. On that temporal fault line, Rome seeks its balance every day, merging the past, present and future of its unparalleled heritage into a single, extraordinary historical moment. Urban Tales is a podcast series by Ep.3, produced by Cora Media. Written and narrated by Filippo Cosmelli, with the support of Marco Villa. Editorial care by Sara Poma. Sound and music supervision by Luca Micheli. Post-production and editing by Andrea Girelli. Project manager Monia Donati. Producer Ilaria Celeghin. Post-production coordination Matteo Scelza. Studio sound engineer Lucrezia Marcelli. Music are licensed by Machiavelli Music and/or Universal Music Publishing Ricordi SRL.